Welcome back to Reviews at the Lane, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about Hollow City by Ransom Riggs. Okay, so I'm about a decade late in reading this one, and not just because the book came out in 2014. Personally, I believe one of the magical things about books is they aren't bound to time the way that movies and TV shows tend to be. No, the reason I feel so behind with this one is this is a sequel, and I read book one about a decade ago. The problem is, I read book one and then almost immediately went to go see the movie that was based on book one, and about 3/4 of the way through the movie, I realized that we're coming up to the end of the book. And the book ending comes, and it goes, and the movie keeps going. And so I was just sitting there going, shit, this is one of those movies where they've combined several books in the series into one movie. And so I left that movie going, well, now there's no point in me reading book two, it's been spoiled for me, and also it looks stupid as hell. Having now read this book, no, that's not what was happening. But I can say it took me a decade to finally, decide to read the second one. And I sorta wish I hadn't. So this book picks up almost exactly where book one ended, which was a bit of a problem because I not only had soft memories of the movie by this point, I also barely remember book one from this point. But that's fine because there's remember what happened last time kind of exposition in books, right? Right? So I'm going to do what this book did not, and I'm going to tell you all the world building stuff that you learn in book one so that you're not lost by my explanation of book two. So peculiars are a special breed of humans born within the normal human race, but with special abilities. They vary wildly from things that are basically superpowers, like the ability to create fireballs with your hand, to, honestly, they're just oddly useless, like one of the girls has a mouth on the back of her head. But some time ago, a group of peculiars did something horrific that created the corrupted. I think they were trying to create immortality for their kind, but instead they just sort of transformed themselves into these weird shadow monsters that are vaguely humanoid but with like tentacle-like tongues that eat people. They're called the Hollogasts, they're invisible, and if they eat enough peculiars, they turn into the Wights. Wights look exactly like humans and can totally pass for human, except they have no pupils, and they're evil! Now, these two kinds of corrupted creatures together start hunting down and devouring peculiars. So the Embrons, which are another specific kind of peculiar who can transform into birds and for some reason can control time, they create time loops, which are like contained spaces where a single day will play out over and over and over and over again, so that basically whoever's in there will repeat the same day. And the thing about this is they do this specifically to protect the peculiar children. They start gathering them all into these time loops as a shield because the Hollogasts and the Wights are not supposed to be able to go into the time loops. The problem is the kids never age, and so they're just sitting there waiting in these time loops for someone out in the wider world to deal with the corrupted. But this book jumps right in where the last one ended, with the kids on the run. They have rescued Miss Peregrine, their Embron, from the Wights who kidnapped her, and they are now escaping their time loop, which has been invaded by the corrupted. But they cannot leave their time loop in the present because to do so would mean that all the time they should have lived over these 70 years would catch up all at once. So the kids would either grow super old or die pretty much instantaneously if they're out in the present world for more than about a day or so. The only option they have is to run away into 1940, which is the year their time loop was established. Now, there is some stuff mentioned about what they are and are not able to do within the past. They cannot fully change the past, but they are in the past. Miss Peregrine is trapped in her bird form, and they are just desperately trying to find someone who can help her. So these kids are on the run through two wars. The war of the Germans bombing the English, because we are in World War II here, but also they are running through the war against the corrupted. The Wights and Hollogasts who want to catch them and eat them or do mysterious experiments on them. These kids just want to survive. And y'all, this book was a bit of a mess. First of all, as I implied, there is next to no what happened last time kind of exposition in the beginning of this book, which would be fine if this was one of those stories that fully stands on its own, but it's not. And not everyone's going to read book 1 and immediately pick up book 2, as proven by me, but also there are some people out there who are either going to, on accident or on purpose, skip book 1 and just pick up book 2. And if they do so, they will be completely lost. There is, at the beginning, a quick, basically, photo gallery of the main characters. These are the photos that inspired the original characters, and you can see there's like one sentence defining what their power is. But that's all we get for information about world building. We don't know what we're not told at the beginning of this one what time loops are, what the hollow ghasts or the whites are. We're not told, about the war. We're not told about the major events of the last book. We're just dropped into the story. And, yeah, you can slowly pick up some of the world building stuff as you go along. But, about halfway through the book, I gave up and looked up a synopsis for book 1, which is something I have never done when reading a sequel in my life. And yeah, I do think they desperately needed, even if it was just a synopsis at the beginning of here's the information you need from book 1. But weirdly, there is, about halfway through the book, there is a 2-page long section out of nowhere that is in italics, that is a different point of view, and is just a description of all the characters standing around doing something as a basic, intro to who they are. And we're given just enough to know what they look like, a basic idea of their personality, and some hint at their power. It would have been super useful at the beginning of the book. But also, I remember having this vague feeling while reading the first one that some of the world building was just a little bit hazy. I'm not sure the time travel aspects were fully thought out, but I might be projecting that onto book 1 because I felt it so strongly with book 2. A lot of the time travel stuff, it doesn't fully make sense. The kids have lived the same day thousands and thousands of times. From 1940 to 2010s, whenever the book starts, they are repeating the same day, and they are aware of the passage of time. They can build new knowledge, and they at least sort of mentally age, but at the same time, they really don't. Claire and Olive act and talk like the 5- and 6-year-olds they appear to be, but with a lifetime's knowledge. And that was actually something I really liked about book 1. There was this weird mixture of childlike and adult-like that really worked for me, but it doesn't work in this one. And partially it's because I don't really see it. Throughout this entire book, most of the kids just act like kids, with the author occasionally telling us, oh, there's a gleam in their eye that looks adult-like. Their tone is somehow adult-like. And the only one who actually shows any really, sounding adult-like tendencies is our lead, who is the only character who is exactly the age he looks like. He has not lived in time loop. So it's a bit weird that he is the one that randomly, especially when he's talking about or to his love interest, just sounds like a 30-year-old hipster for no reason. But the real problem here is just the logic of the time loops. So these kids and all the peculiar children across the known peculiar world have basically been frozen in childhood for decades and decades to protect them and to save them. Which, yeah, you need to protect the kids, good. But that means they will never get a chance to be adults. Because if they step out of the time loop, they'll immediately age up to, either old age or death. And that means they're never going to have kids. If the idea was to save the race, they have instead doomed it. Even if the older kids who are, above puberty and therefore, old enough to reproduce, if they decided to, within the time loop, try to produce another generation, their bodies don't change, so presumably they're not going to be able to live through a pregnancy. And if they do make it to, having a baby, it's stated that peculiardom skips a generation. It's usually 1 or 2 generations before peculiar traits show up again. So they'd need to have a couple of generations of normal babies before we started to see peculiar children. And that's a problem because normals can't go into time loops. So even if they managed to somehow get pregnant and have babies, if they were normal, they would not survive. So, what was the end game here? And, I understand that maybe the thought was they would only be in these time loops for a couple of years, which would be a fine amount to age back up, but, someone had to have drawn the line at some point and said, hey, if we don't get these kids out of time loops now, the race is going to die. And, maybe they think they're going to leave in the time that the loop was established, because we see that these kids can wander around 1940 without suddenly aging up. But it's also stated that they cannot affect time in 1940 in the same way, so I'm just really not sure what's going on here. And there is the problem of aging forward in general. Like, that is something I really like about this, like, conception of time travel. It's very interesting, it's logical, it's a dangerous thing to think about, it provides a lot of emotional struggle, but it's super inconsistently applied. At one point we come across several peculiars who have aged forward to the point of death, but they are inside of an active time loop. How do they age forward inside of a time loop? In fact, the implication here is they are inside the time loop that they have lived for generations or decades, so why do they age up? And, like, maybe the idea is that they died outside of the time loop and then were dragged inside, but the problem is one of their bodies has become so, like, old and ancient that it crumbles to the touch. And also, for that matter, one guy looks pretty much exactly like he's sleeping, but when they touch him, he crumbles. But then there are others that have already rot into skeletons, so, like, why did some rot and others don't? And, like, all of it just does not feel thought out. It really felt like the author had found some photos that sparked the idea of what the kids would find in the time loop and just thought no further about it. And that leads me to one of my other big problems about this book. It feels like the author was leaning really heavily on the gimmick. So these books, what makes them interesting, or one of the things that makes them interesting, is the author basically found a series of creepy old photos that inspired the books and, like, inspired what the characters would be and that sort of stuff. And so this book continues the trend. We have random photos and the author works them into the story. And, like, the weird thing is, book one did not feel gimmicky at all. It felt like, you know, the author had searched out the photos after the story was written, because the story felt organic and natural and like it flowed correctly. But this one? No. This one feels very much like the author found these photos, laid them out in a line, and is just playing connect the dots to make the different bits work. And that means that some of these elements don't feel like they fit in the book. Like, why is there a girl with a hole in her chest? Probably because the author found a photo of a girl with a hole in her chest and decided he was going to work it into the book. And, like, the character appears out of nowhere, does basically nothing to impact the actual narrative, introduces a theme that will already be presented, like, 2 other times. We don't need her to introduce it. And then she disappears with no other thought about her. And, like, why was there the half-invisible boy holding the trumpet? Why was he holding the trumpet when we met him? Because the photo shows him holding a trumpet, so the author just described a reason for him to be holding a trumpet. And, like, there were even some that were the other way that felt like the photo was sort of shoehorned into the narrative. Like, specifically, there's one moment that they meet a dog who's telling them this, oh, so tragic story that he was forced to draw a cart, and it's so tragic because it was so demeaning. And the problem is, this is the photo. And that doesn't look demeaning, that doesn't look horrifying, and also it doesn't look like a photo, it looks like an etching. But it also does not match the way the dog itself is described in the book, so it's just sort of like, could you not find a photo that actually looked like what you're describing? And overall, a lot of this book felt like we were rushing from one image to the next. And on that note, the pacing in this book is just hella rushed. There is almost no downtime, from the boats to the storm to the cave to being chased through the woods to the menagerie. Then we do get, like, the shortest of short break. Like, they are there for maybe an hour and the kids are on the run again. But the author's also trying to give us a lot of emotional moments, so we get these insanely short little passages where the characters need to have entire emotional breakdowns or romantic revelations or whatnot before being rushed back into the action. And that is the first of many reasons that this book has a bit of a tonal whiplash problem. Like, we'll go from this life and death standoff to a tragic backstory to a joyful reunion to a desperate escape, all in 4 pages. And, like, that is fine occasionally. Like, objectively, what a climax often is too much action packed into one little section. But it starts to be really tiring when it's in the entire damn book. And also, it makes the characters feel rather monstrous when they are playfully trying on clothes, laughing, flirting, and joking less than an hour after stumbling upon the corpses and bloodstains from a slaughter. And to make it even worse, they have survivors from the slaughter standing right next to them. Like, it just does not work. On top of that, the actual writing can't seem to make up its mind as to what style of prose it wants to be. Like, sometimes the book sounds like a fairy tale with lots of whimsical descriptions, talking animals, and simple actions. And then a paragraph later, we're in a far more literary book, with philosophical thoughts, creative metaphors, introspection, and creative sentence structure. And then a few pages later, we're in a fast-paced, written for readability, heavy on the romance and action kind of YA fantasy book. And it's like trying to read a book that one page was written by T.J. Klune, the next was written by Donna Tartt, and the next was written by Suzanne Collins, and none of them read the others' contributions before writing theirs. Now, that being said, some of the more literary passages were absolutely gorgeous. This is why I remember really loving the first book by the end of it. There are these random moments that, out of the blue, I wanted to put the book down and just live in the prose for a while. Some of those unusual metaphors were the kind of unusual metaphors that completely make me rethink how I feel about what was described. Some of the descriptions of the setting and the environment were just so vivid and emotive. But that made it even more infuriating when that absolute beauty is immediately followed by slapstick scenes where no one is acting like a human being. Because, yeah, one of my biggest problems with this book is there are so many minor passing characters that don't act in any kind of way that makes sense to me. Like, why did the train station attendant immediately jump to violence when a group of kids that they assumed were evacuees instead said they weren't and they weren't getting back on the train? Why did the Romani throw the kids in the cages? Why did no one even ask why a group of soldiers was holding children at gunpoint? At least once a chapter I was asking myself, like, yeah, but why is that person doing that? And then we meet the other peculiars at the end, and why are they so aggressive at the carnival when they knew these kids were peculiars? Why do they jump to aggressively demanding these children immediately swear to join an army literally seconds after they arrive? In what world do people see kids who have been on the run for days, haven't eaten, haven't slept, have seen death, and don't at least check to see if they're okay, see if they're traumatized, see if they need anything, before start immediately berating them to start fighting? And, like, it's pretty damn clear who a fucking white is. Like, you can see that they don't have pupils. And, like, yeah, there are such a thing as colored contacts, but we don't see any characters in this book using them. No, if they want to hide their eyes, they wear sunglasses. And so it should be really fucking obvious that our main characters, when they wander into a scene, are not whites. And yet there are numerous times throughout this book where they meet other peculiars and are immediately accused of being secretly whites. And then there's the too many characters problem. Our main cast is 10 children. 10 of them. 2 of them do leave at one point, but then we pick up 3 more. It made it really hard for me to keep it straight in my mind who was who. And the book didn't have enough time to let each kid have, like, big character building moments, so instead all we get are these, like, random passing moments when the author gives us a description of how every individual character reacts. So, like, we often get, we'll get, like, event, then I gasped, Emma raised her hand, Millard ran, Enoch laughed, Olive cried, etc. And this, A, starts to feel like a roll call, but also, this is the reason that most books don't have this big of a cast. Or if they do, they split them up at certain points so that they can go off and do their own things on different pages, and we don't have to see every single character responding to every single thing all the damn time. But my last big qualm with this book, I feel like I have to talk about, is the Romani. This book features a random group of Romani people. And first of all, the book does not call them that. It uses the G word, which, for anyone out there who does not know this, yes, gypsy is a slur. You should not be calling people that. The actual term is Roma or Romani. And this book came out recently enough that someone involved in publishing it should have known this. And yeah, when we meet the characters, we're in 1940, and in 1940, that is the term that would have been used. And for that matter, a lot of our characters, even though they have lived in the modern era, they were also separated from it, so they sort of do come from the past. But On the other side of that, our main character is from the present. He is a modern-day boy. And the characters interact with and chat with the Romani, and they mention that the Romani have been allies to the Peculiars, so someone in this book could have said, hey, that's not what, like, they should be called, without it being anachronistic or weird. And therefore, I feel like someone should have. And also, even if you just leave the word aside, there's just the representation of them in this book is not great by any stretch of the imagination. Like, their big action in the first half of the book is to throw a group of children in a cage. And, like, the only reason they let them out, spoilers, because they find out they're peculiar. And the implication here is that these people would have been perfectly fine, had no trouble whatsoever, with kidnapping and turning a group of children over to soldiers who seem to be wanting to kill them for money. And that's exceptionally tone-deaf, considering one of the best-known stereotypes about Romani is that they stereotypically steal children. So this was just not a great thing to include in this book. And I know the author was trying to use this entire section as an introduction to the major theme of the book, but I'm also not entirely sure that the major theme of the book was fully well addressed. So the major theme in this book is the question of whether it is moral and correct to put the health, happiness, and safety of your group in front of the lives and safety of those outside of your group. So, like, is it right to fight for your family if that fight might hurt strangers? Is it right to kill normals to prevent the entirety of peculiardom from dying off? And that's an interesting theme, though I'm not sure it's handled exceptionally well. Like, themes in books really exist in two ways. Either they are questions that the books will leave open for the audience to interpret, or they are arguments that the book is trying to make one way or the other. And this book, sometimes it felt like it was just leaving a question open, and sometimes it felt like it was making an argument, and it would switch back and forth in a really inconsistent way. Like, there are two separate moments that our leads are called out for putting the lives of peculiars above the lives of normals, but it's muddled by the fact that it seems like in this version of time travel, if you change something in the past, the world just readjusts itself to, like, undo your change. So, like, if you save a child from a bomb, that child will die in a car crash a few days later. So nothing they do in the past will actually have an effect, which undercuts the argument that they're being callous by not doing something to help these people in the past. Then there's the whole, like, will you join the army to fight for peculiardom argument at the back of the book, into the book. So it's fully framed as a question of, will you fight to protect the outgroup of all peculiardom, even if that's putting a risk to your in-group, your little family of peculiars? And it's a false dichotomy. There are many, many options between joining a half-assed, barely organized, clearly doomed army and just running the fuck away. And no one, at any point, like, even asks, hey, maybe can we help in our own way? Or, hey, can we wait to see what Miss Peregrine says when she is here? Or maybe we'll see if we can find the Embrins, and depending on where they're being kept, we might or might not help, depending on if we think there's a chance. Or, like, how about you come with us to wherever we run away to, regroup, and we'll figure out what's possible once we, like, gather all our resources? No, it's presented as either join our army and die for peculiardom, or save yourselves by running away. And that being a false dichotomy undercuts the general, like, thrust of the book, because we can feel that it's empty and hollow. But overall, my feelings on this book was that I was reading the worst book by a really good author. There's a lot of really good writing in this book, and a lot of really good ideas, and some interesting themes that are not fully handled, but overall, it's just muddled by tonal inconsistency, erratic world building, bad pacing, and questionable character motivations. This could have been an absolutely stellar book, and that's why I found it so annoying that it's mediocre at best. So, yeah, I would say maybe skip Hollow City, but maybe see if Ransom Riggs has gotten anything else published.